Welcome to the most recent addition to the High Performance Multifamily video series, which is presented by the Connecticut Green Bank as an extension of its monthly peer-to-peer networking group meetings. That group was formed to gather diverse professionals working in the multifamily housing sector to share their knowledge of high-performing design and implementation. The Connecticut Green Bank is a quasi-state agency created to support the state's energy strategy to achieve cleaner sources of energy while creating jobs and supporting a local economic development. I'm Dean Evans. I'm an architect, and I'm your co-moderator today, along with Kathy Dorgan, also an architect. Both of us are members of the peer-to-peer network exchange. And today we are joined by James Geppner. Following his years in project finance, where he evaluated companies and studied markets, he has applied social science and competitive theory to a range of issues in order to see what's shaping a market, a cause, or a behavior. Most recently, he did an extensive analysis of the market for passive buildings and the decision-making process of buyers, funders, and end users in order to find clues as to how to increase the size of the market and how to reduce the barriers to widespread adoption of passive technology. Today, he's going to walk us through his current thinking on this topic during his talk. James.
Hi, thank you. So this webinar is the decision being made right next to us, and it's just a short, brief discussion around decision-making, particularly decision-making around new construction, although some of the ideas that we discuss will certainly pertain to the decisions around retrofits as well. But for the sake of simplicity, just think of what follows to be pertaining primarily to new construction. So there's a conference that's given every year. It's the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference. This is a slide presented by Elke Weber and from Princeton from one of her presentations. If you look at the column in the middle, a couple of years ago, the conference host saw that about 12% of the attendees of this conference chose the vegetarian option. Now, this is significant because the attendees of this conference are people who are incredibly aware of the importance of or the implications of choosing a vegetarian option for climate change, very important of what the drivers, very knowledgeable about what the drivers are of climate change, and in most cases have actually dedicated quite a bit of their careers to addressing climate change. So it's telling that 12% chose the vegetarian option. That compares with 5% over there on the left, which is the national average of the number of people that choose the vegetarian option at conferences. So the people hosting this conference wanted to see if they could get that number up. And after studying the issue, they did one small thing, one nearly invisible thing for the people registering with that conference, and that changed the number of people signing up for the vegetarian option by almost 600%, from 12% to 80% of all conference attendees.
Wow, that's amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about how they changed the question?
So I'd love to save that because it's a lever that is very common, but at the same time, the more we get into the specific levers, the more we'll wonder, how is that possible?
Right.
and I'd like to review those, a few of those together, because what's difficult to understand in this is how things that can seem so invisible to us, how dramatically they can shape our behavior.
Okay, I'm waiting.
Let me touch on that later if I could. So this is a piece of data that many of you may have seen already. It's the number of organ donors, or the percentage of participants of organ donations around the world, with low donation countries on the left and high donation countries on the right. So when looking at this, you might think like, okay, so what's driving those high numbers in the countries on the right, from Austria to Belgium and France, Hungary, and so forth? And why is that different in countries like Denmark and the Netherlands and the UK? Well, it's not culture, because we can see that some of the countries on the left and right actually have very similar cultures. And it's not individuals, because there's nothing so profound in differences in the individuals between one country and another. It's actually the context in which the decision is made that's really driving that difference. And So this is an intriguing thing. We basically can see that the environment is having a profound shape on our decisions. And when a person does something, we tend to attribute that behavior to the individual and even tell a story because it's very easy to do so. And so it's automatic for us to basically attribute intention and causes and desires to an individual. It's much more difficult to think about how the environment shapes our decisions or our behavior. But in those two examples, you can see how profoundly the environment does actually shape a person's decisions. So the question is raised by these two slides, and this is a point raised by Dan Ariely recently at Duke University. If the decision is shaped by the environment, who really is the decision maker? Is it that individual who's signing up for organ donations, or is it that person who designed the sign-up process? And what role does the person who designed that process play in the decision? So this is an important issue. This is a headline I just saw the other day that just popped out at me. So it shows that this is not a trivial issue. Figuring out how decisions are made is really important, particularly when we're thinking about things with really severe consequences. And this is something that I think is incredibly relevant to us as well in the high energy and high performance building space. So here's a little thought experiment. If you're driving down a road and you see that there's a curved road ahead sign on the road and it's knocked down, well, it's a high-speed road, so you see that cars go quite fast down this road and you know exactly what's going to happen. So you see the outcomes. So what do? Do you stop and prop up the sign? Because if you don't stop and prop up the sign, you know exactly what's going to occur, right? So if you do stop and prop up the sign, you're changing the I can't say the word anymore, the decision environment. You're basically disclosing information that will help a person make a different decision to slow down and take that curve at a slower speed. This to me is the question that architects, builders, and lenders face. Because what we see is that there are predictable errors made because just like this car, they didn't see that there was a curved road ahead sign in front of them. So architects, builders, and lenders, although our focus here is primarily on architects and builders, are witness to an incredibly consequential decision, whether it's from the home buyer or from the developer. And it's common, and I want to say it's even our default response to think of decisions as being rational, is to think of everyone being a rational actor, when in fact we all face very severe limitations on our decision making. We all depend on shortcuts in order to make decisions because one easy way to think about it is our brains are an energy saving device. We have far too many pieces of information to process, far too many decisions to make, to be able to make each one deliberatively and with full information. And so we make decisions in conditions of uncertainty. We act on partial information. We rely on shortcuts, and we try to make the best decision we can. And we're very good at it. We actually make really good decisions when things are extremely near term. But we make a lot of mistakes when some of those consequences are farther out in the future. So for the home buyer, a problem that's very common is what I call the brother-in-law problem, which is the home buyer meets with an architect and the architect tells them about a passive house and they're incredibly interested. And then that person goes home and they end up in a conversation with their brother-in-law who makes some offhanded remark, and then that's it. The home buyer doesn't want a passive house anymore. So basically what the home buyer has done is they've met with an expert and received expert information and then talked to a non-expert and weighted the non-expert's information more heavily than the expert's information. That is one in our research. We did pretty extensive research on the interactions between home buyers and architects, and designed a process or a system that would overcome this and other challenges. But when we first started researching that interaction and how the home buyer responded when they were presented with the option of building a conventional house or building a passive house or zero energy house, initially we listed as many as 85 barriers that would prevent the home buyer from opting for the passive house or the zero energy house. So we really wanted to see how many we could surmount. And when we focused close on it, we saw that there were 8 in particular that were really inhibiting this market and preventing this person from choosing the zero energy house or the passive house. With the developer, we're just starting this research, or I shouldn't say we're just starting it. We've been at it for a while, but we're still developing tools. But one of the errors that developers make is a status quo bias, which you might just think of it as an aversion to the unfamiliar. There are things that they might not know about the design process, or fears that they might have about making early decisions and having that not being able to make changes later on. There might be uncertainty about the mechanical systems. There's any number of barriers, and of course there's always assumptions about costs. But we tend to go towards costs, and really there are many other issues behind that that are, I want to say, are larger drivers, and cost is what's made as an excuse. So anyway, this is any number of problems and errors that these two decision makers make in the midst of, or in the company of, architects and builders. And then of course there's a larger environment when they walk outside the offices of architects and builders. HGTV, I want to say, if you want to make a bad decision, a person couldn't do much better than watch a lot of HGTV. And the quote on the right is actually from when I was looking around for a house in 2007, exactly what a realtor said to me. I explained to them that that wasn't the case, that any asset can lose value, but they completely weren't interested. Not only were not interested in what I had to say, but really stuck to their guns right before the market crashed. So this just shows you that here is just like the curve road ahead sign being down, the decision environment isn't a particularly good one. In other words, the environment as is pushes people to a bad decision. So again, what does an architect or builder do, knowing that a lot of the information out there pushes people to make mistakes that are going to be costly in terms of their long-term decisions? It won't deliver them the best outcomes. So there's a process here with, with large, amorphous, and difficult to grasp things. It's like, where do you begin? Where is this all occurring? At which point, where do we enter into this? How do we break this down and turn this amorphous and difficult to grasp issue, the issue of how to help people make better decisions and turn them towards zero energy buildings? How do we break it down into simple, actionable procedures? The first thing is to really start with this question. What can we do to reliably and consistently get home buyers and developers to opt for a passive house or zero energy building? In other words, instead of thinking about how can we get people to do it more, under what circumstance would almost everyone make that choice? What would be the conditions? What would be in the decision environment that would enable them to do this, that would encourage and facilitate that particular behavior and that choice? Once we ask that question, we see that that we start to see an environment taking shape, and we start to see things that we can do. Another way of looking at this is what are the circumstance or position from which the person can see how much better this choice is than the alternatives? What is that vantage point? Frederick Olmsted, in many of his designs, does this thing where he restricts your view and carries you along a narrow path, and then has a hedgerow or something that serves as an obstacle, and then at the end has taken you to exactly the place that he wants you to see a vista or some amazing view. And that's kind of what I'm describing here, or using as an analogy, which is this is the opportunity that architects and builders have to carry people along to a place where they actually can see the particular value of attributes of passive and zero energy buildings. So with any behavior, we can think about fuel and friction. The fuel is the motivation, the friction are the barriers or opposing forces that prevent that behavior. So the question is, how do we add more fuel? How do we add more motivation? And what are those specific barriers? And like I said, with the home buyer, our initial list was a list of around 85. We boiled it down to around 8 that needed to be addressed. And these are things that had not been addressed as far as I had seen in any of the conversations around in the passive house community or the zero energy building community. With developers, we have that list at about 12 right now. There are more, but we see about 12 big ones that are problems. And if we want to break that further, we can use this behavioral model, which is a model from the behaviorist Kurt Lewin. So let's look at a separate issue, going to the gym. Let's say a person, to be as specific about the behavior as we can, person wants to go to the gym at Tuesday at 6 p.m. and they're a 35-year-old office employee. So there are promoting pressures behind that and there are inhibiting pressures. The promoting pressure is they want to get in shape. They recognize the advantages of being in shape. Maybe there's a particular class that they like, or they have a memory of feeling good when they go to it. An inhibiting pressure is a friend always asks them to go for a drink, or it's the end of the day and they have low energy, or any number of things, right? An old friend of mine actually told me that because friends would ask her to go for a drink, she would just say she had a shrink appointment whenever she wanted to go to the gym. Because people, when you say you're going to go to the gym, they always try to talk you out of it, but no one tries to talk you out of going to a shrink appointment. I thought that was a pretty good idea. So when we remove some of these inhibiting pressures, we don't have to think about increasing the promoting pressures. When we start to remove the inhibiting pressures, we start to see the behaviors become basically unrestrained, and it crosses that threshold at which the behavior occurs. So another way of looking at this is, how do you sell water in the desert? You don't have to have a fancy campaign to describe the benefits of water. You don't have to use this particular language to describe the virtues of water. You just say, I have water, because the person crossing the desert needs water. And when it comes to passive house and zero energy buildings, people need water. They need, there's asthma, there's unmet need, there's asthma, there's lack of focus, there's sleep conditions, there's other respiratory ailments, there's low savings rates. These are things that challenges that people already have and they recognize as problems. So their promoting pressures are already there. So really examining some of the inhibiting pressures in incredible detail will reveal to us opportunities about what to do when people meet with us and in interactions to push them towards opting for one of these buildings. And I should also say, the goal is not, there's an ethical standard that we can think of. The goal is not to push a person to a choice. It's to give them full information. And right now, people lack full information. So a simple example is like the one discussed above. People don't know and account for the possibility of mold growing in the walls, or how the probability of needing to replace their furnace, or the probability of needing to replace the roof and the costs associated with that. They don't necessarily calculate the cumulative amount of money, the net present value of their energy and repair costs. So just enabling a fully informed decision will allow them to make the best choice. And from all the calculations that I've done, passive house and zero energy buildings are far less expensive when you really do the math than conventional buildings. So we accept the fact that we have physical limitations. If we encounter a big rock like this, we recognize that we're going to need a crane or a tractor to pull it up. But it's really hard for us to get our heads around the fact that we have cognitive limitations too. We have limitations of attention. We have limitations of comprehension. We have a limited amount of time that we dedicate to problems. So again, we tend to think that we're rational actors and that we're able to make great decisions, but we take many shortcuts and we make errors in those as we make those shortcuts. So because of these shortcuts and because of the difference in the technology between passive house and conventional buildings, the outcomes provided by these buildings are different, and so are the challenges. What's really obvious to me is that selling any high performance building the same way that buildings have been sold historically does not work at all. It does not account for the challenges and the difference in the decision making. So people that rely on past processes to talk about the buildings are going to really end up having the developer or the home buyer do a price comparison on the construction costs and say that the zero energy building is more expensive. And of course, that is an error because, again, the outcomes are different. But they'll end up coming to that conclusion. Another way of looking at it is just think about how we learn. You know, we don't need to spend a lot of time on teaching people not to touch hot stoves. And the reason is because it's an ideal learning condition. There's immediate feedback and there's an unambiguous link between the action and the result. So there's a clear causal chain, and that's what we think of. We think in terms of causal chains. But with home buyers and developers, the feedback is extremely delayed. Think about the mold in the walls. So there's frequently a failure to connect the outcomes to the decision. So if a person buys a home and then 10 years later has mold in their walls and needs to rip out their drywall or replace their windows, or there's water intrusion, they'll probably attribute it to bad luck, but I think they'll seldom go, oh, that was part of this is inherent to the decision that I made 10 years prior. I made a flawed decision, and a better decision with a better decision process, I could have changed this outcome. And that's because we actually know what the implications of their decision. So it's really important that we try to disclose that as much as possible to make those outcomes as salient and vivid as possible so they can make that fully informed decision. So it's also good to remember that people buy outcomes and not things. So if we compare building 1, building 2, and building 3, there are different outcomes, and each outcomes, is there a market for it? Do people value it? Is it a decrease in risk? One thing that developers face is they discount a lot of risks in conventional buildings. And if they were fully pricing those risks, they could see that the zero energy building option was a lot less expensive than they were accounting for. So here's another way of saying the same thing. Some outcomes are really distant, and by the time we see those outcomes, the decision has long passed. If those outcomes were more visible, think about low savings rates. Those outcomes are more visible, then we might make a different decision. So kind of the question is to think about these outcomes, whether it's mold in the walls, whether it's high vacancy rates for developers, whether it's price competition for, when the developer is trying to sell a property to a property owner, because that property owner has lots of different options available to them. When we look at these options, or these outcomes, we can start to bake them into the decision process. We'll see we can make a better or facilitate a better decision for home buyers and developers. This is kind of an obvious thing, but if we really look in a granular way what the different outcomes are for the individual, and then ask, how do we make these vivid and salient to the person? So one of the things, again, I've listed there are tons of barriers to opting for a zero energy building or a passive house. But it's also important to recognize that there are some tremendous advantages that architects, builders, and lenders too have. One is these are face-to-face interactions. Think about, back to that earlier slide, there was an intervention done that lasted seconds, if not less, and got a really dramatic result. Here we have meetings that last hours with home buyers and developers. So there's a tremendous amount that can be done here. A tremendous amount that can undo, I want to say, the damage or the misinformation that's done by some of the other sources of information like HGTV. architects, builders, and lenders have tremendous authority. So the home buyer and developer are receptive to what they're saying. The outcomes satisfy really important unmet needs by developers and home buyers. And also, and this is probably the most important one, or these last two are the most important one, people do have preferences, of course, but how people make a decision is entirely up in the air. Very few people have set or rigid expectations about how they should make a particular decision. So there's a tremendous opportunity to give a process by which this decision is made that will affect what the ultimate decision is. And this is really where the opportunity is for architects, builders, and lenders. And lastly, of course, you control the decision environment. So what is actually in that immediate environment is completely up to you, and there's a lot that can be done there. A lot of this just comes down to process. Whenever a football player runs and does a spectacular play, or when some athlete comes and is interviewed, or when some Olympian does some amazing feat, some interview asks them, how do you do it? What were you thinking about? And frequently, the answer is exactly this. I just focused on the process. I was working with my coach. I was thinking about the process and not the result. Just process, process, process. And so really anticipating all the barriers in the meeting and being ready to hit every pitch and practicing hitting every pitch. So this is, I want to say this is basically what we're doing with one program called the Meeting Map. It's actually, we designed a process which is designed to help architects and builders hit every pitch. And we want to do one for developers as well. That's underway. But really looking at every single barrier and coming up with a effective solution against them. Another thing that's really important, because all this is about what can you do? What is really within your control? And if there's any point about this presentation, it's that there's a tremendous amount that's within your control. I'm not getting into obviously the specifics here because there's a lot more to say, but a lot of it comes down to really how an architect or builder feels when a person walks out of their office. Do they say, this is out of my hands, I was unlucky, that wasn't the right person, or they didn't get it, or costs need to come down, or I'm waiting for code? Those things are all out of your hands. And so do they basically describe the event that just occurred in a way that gives them no agency or control or influence over the outcome? Or do they say, there's a lot I can do, and really think about what they can do despite where costs are and despite where code is? In my view, the market can transform as it is now with where costs are and where code is, because there are sufficient incentives, because the unmet needs are so striking and there is such value in the attributes of passive house and zero energy buildings. So really, what do people come away and do? Do they constantly assign a thing that says, oh, there's nothing I can do? And the reason that this is important is because we all have built in us an urge for a positive self-narrative. So if something doesn't go our way, it's really, it's habitual, and it's very likely that we'll say, that was bad luck. We don't want to attribute it to our actions. Whereas if we get a win, we said, that was me. So breaking ourselves of this habit and going, okay, that wasn't the outcome I want. What can I examine in the process to improve the process to get a better result? So really resisting that urge for a positive self-narrative and trying to say, let's reason for accuracy here. How do I, rather than reasoning to find out why I was right or I did the best I could, reasoning to think, what about this process can be better? We're designing a system, and that system is to get people to make the best decisions possible. I should also say, when I say the best decision possible, I'm not even talking about about climate change. Really, everything that we've done at Erase40 just takes climate change off the issue and says, what are the incentives that are to that decision maker? The immediate incentives, not the ones that are socialized, not the ones that are based in ethics, but ones that are immediately returned, or not immediately, but returned directly to that decision maker, whether it's the home buyer or developer. So even without that, I think there are sufficient benefits in that choice to justify that decision. So some things to remember: recognize that selling high-performance buildings is incredibly different than selling conventional buildings, and it requires a completely different process. When it comes to making complex decisions, really, we all, including experts, need assistance. Daniel Kahneman's work on people in finance and examining decisions that doctors make really uncovers the flaws that are even endemic to experts. Small changes in the environment can have a really large effect on the decision. Architects, builders, and lenders really, you can say this is a choice about their own identity or how they see themselves, but it's, do they want to be bystanders to a bad decision, where they're the people that's standing on the side of the road where they see people driving off the cliff to mold in the walls and other bad outcomes, or do they want to change the environment so those errors in judgment are less likely? And lastly, really the status quo is largely behavioral dependent. There is a small number of predictable errors, and because they're predictable, we can anticipate them and be prepared for them so they don't actually result in a bad decision. So in the end, I want to say, basically, there's no reason to wait anymore. This market can be set in motion now if we take ownership over these decisions. The decisions aren't ours, but we can foster the best decisions possible in a number of ways, and doing that can set this market in motion. And this is not an uncommon thing. In fact, just here's a little quote from the Harvard Business Review. It says, organizations are increasingly looking at behavioral science throughout their organization, not just in sales, but in product design, in looking at markets, in training sales force. That it works in any number of ways. And with interactions with home buyers and developers, I think it can actually make a pretty profound difference. So Kathy, back to your question from the beginning, the lever was a default. And what's interesting about defaults is that when defaults are used, what frequently happens is inertia just carries them in that direction. So the decision's been made, so they don't exert the additional energy to question that decision. They can completely question the decision, right? There's nothing that inhibits them from making a change, but it requires a little bit of energy. So, and in the case of those two forms, that little bit of energy is opt-out language. You know, you just check a box that says, I opt not to do this, but you're already opted in each case.
Very interesting.
And so I believe this is the last slide. We have, for that particular tool and the process that we've designed for home buyers, we have an upcoming workshop at the Construction Institute on December 4th. I believe it's like a 6-hour workshop to train people on how to have these conversations with home buyers. We're having this studied now. We have some people in academia who are actually doing tests to see exactly what the impact of this process will be. I'm working with, based on a number of things and some of the evidence that we've used, that it should increase rates of adoption between 2 to 4 times of what the current rate of adoption of those prospects are. And here's information here in case you want to get in touch with me. Please do. That's why we're here, is to have these conversations. And that is everything.
Terrific, James. Thanks. That was a lot to unpack there, but that was really fascinating in terms of the world that we live in with, you know, as architects, engineers, all the people involved in the development of, in this case, multifamily housing, and how these kinds of sort of restructuring the approach to all the different processes in that ecosystem, whether it's developers talking to architects, architects talking to home buyers or clients, clients talking to developers, users. I can see there's a lot of sort of contradiction and complexity, to quote an old architect phrase. But I had just a couple of questions for you based on just the last thing you said about opting out. That's kind of fascinating. I mean, so I try to, let's imagine this as a conversation between, a developer and, one of the peer-to-peer network architects who are working on a project somewhere, Kathy, for example. And you could almost conceptually start the conversation from the architect's perspective as this is going to be a net zero building. In order to it not be, you're going to have to opt out of that as the developer. I mean, that's a really simplistic way to look at it, but it would reframe as if you're trying to sell the net zero or the zero energy building. You're saying, no, that's where we're starting from. That it's a decision made already, unless you want to unmake it. I mean, am I interpreting that as that's possible as a way to approach these conversations based on the work you've done?
So that is absolutely possible, and there's one architect that does that. I think that is from all my research, that isn't the first go-to that I'd use, but that is because if people opt out, they might opt out strongly against it.
Right.
It might be hard to bring them back to it. But if I could even again, there are many. One of the difficulties here is that when talking about zero energy buildings and passive house, there is a desire to go to look for that silver bullet here, say this thing or this piece of language or this one thing. With the meeting map and the thing that would be training at the Construction Institute workshop, there may be like 25 things that are working in concert to elicit the desired behaviors. So there's a lot of complexity. The tool itself is seamless, but there's a lot of things working in tandem. But instead of presenting a person, just back to your question, with a default about a zero energy building, what you might do is, let's just say you're in an environment with a constrained footprint. Say you'll have this amount of usable space, and if the person says they don't want to go to zero energy building, or you say that's assuming zero energy building, if you want to go away from that, we might want to shave that back 10%. So in other words, by going to the default on an attribute of the zero energy building, if they want to go against that, if they want to opt out, they suffer a loss.
Yeah, gotcha. That makes sense. I've got a couple others. Kathy, do you have any questions that have come to mind?
Yeah, I think you've really hit on, Dean, some of the things that I've been thinking about is how do you implement this? And it reminds me of some people talking about the stealth passive house, where instead of saying we're going to go for passive house standard, they kind of look at each decision and say, it would be great here if we could make sure that we have good, healthy air through an ERV that would do this thing, and break it down into this series of decisions rather than the one big go, no go. Does that fit into this framework?
Absolutely. If we think about, so I just brought to this slide because that's exactly the process that we use here and use it in a very specific manner. I'm just thinking about how far to step back from your question. So let's a little bit of evolution. To our earlier selves back on the savannah, we weren't interested in energy efficiency. Wasn't a term that meant anything to us. Passive house is a thing that doesn't mean anything to us, but we have very strong pre-existing motivations for certain things. And to the extent that we are having that, we have a finite amount of time with the home buyer and with the developer. To the extent that we are spending all of that time talking about things where there's a pre-existing motivation, the easier time we're going to have. So for the meeting map, which is the thing that we talk about in this workshop, we do exactly that, break it down into individual discrete choices. It's really optional for the architect or builder to ever even use the phrase passive house.
And so in terms of that, then because the conversation oftentimes is sort of conceptually or abstractly framed as a conversation between an architect and developer. The developer knows what they want. The architect, sort of works with them to fulfill that vision, or maybe not. Maybe it's a back and forth. But in this case, it sounds to me like it's more like the architect, or the we that's trying to promote high performance buildings, and that's going to put up the barrier on the curve in the road, already have a destination we want to get to. It'll have lots of variations in it once we're there, but it's going to be a high performance facility at the end of these managed persuasive conversations. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Because one of the things that struck me that you talked about was the timeline, and that there's these distant. The world we live in has distant results. Typically, right. It's a slow industry, and so the conversation, as if I heard, I thought the word salient and vivid. It sounds like a great name for a rock and roll band, but it's also a great concept to me, salient and vivid, about how you make these distant results salient and vivid so they're compelling, if I heard that correctly. Yeah, but is that right? Because then I'm also thinking that but if you concentrated on less distant things also, and making them compelling and interesting, and they're all part of getting to the salient and vivid, more distant stuff, that's what the process, these persuasive conversations, is sort of about. Is that a way to sort of characterize that, or is it a little bit different?
Well, so let me sort of reinterpret what you just said in a particular way, because yes, I want to agree, but I want to sort of reframe it. If just as an example, there's a conversation with a developer where an architect says you are going to have less uncertainty around property insurance, or this is going to be your valuation, and here's what's going to drive your higher valuation for a zero energy building. Then now it's like, okay, so that's the long-term reward. What is your immediate reward? Well, your immediate reward is that you're a prudent business person. Your immediate reward is that you've avoided some mistakes that others have made. Your immediate reward is maybe some recognition by peers around you that you actually brought up some important issues in this conversation, and so you're actually on the right path. It might be that there's more different capital available, so you can actually say, okay, so here are some long-term things, but also what are those immediate rewards, so there can be encouragement to carry that person along the path.
Gotcha.
You mentioned energy savings as one of the issues that comes along, and we have a lot of debates within our professional circles about whether high performance buildings should be sold as quality or as cost savings. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, that brings up a great issue. I had a conversation earlier today that I forgot to mention this point. When we say like quality or comfort or resilience, if you go into Daniel Kahneman's work and others as well, he describes the brain, the systems of the brain being broken up into system 1 and system 2. And system 1 is automatic, effortless, and beyond our conscious awareness. And system 2 is more energy intensive, effortful, and deliberative, and we use it very sparingly. So if you say something like resilience or comfort or quality, those are all very abstract terms. And so what that requires is for the deliberative process in our brain to retranslate that and find the specific to make it real and alive. So if we just take comfort, it requires deliberative energy to go, what does comfort mean? Oh, it might mean bare feet in the basement in January. But if you say bare feet in the basement in January, that goes through our brain immediately, is immediately impactful, and people, without even saying comfort, extract comfort and can generally apply it. So some of the more abstract notions, or I want to say higher level ideas that Passive House has described, we anticipate people will react to those things, but in fact, we're actually depending on them to do quite a bit of cognitive work, which is unlikely that they're going to do. Furthermore, one thing that's really important about behavior is that knowledge does not correlate with behavior. So, something like 80% of smokers know that smoking causes heart disease and lung cancer, and yet they continue to smoke. So there are a lot of behaviors where people already have the knowledge. And back to the awareness of the issue on that first slide with the people attending the climate change conference, people have the knowledge, but that doesn't elicit the behavior. So to some extent, talking about framing zero energy buildings and Passive House as being higher quality and the issue of comfort or resilience, I actually find those to be, it's not that it's wrong, but it's not far enough. But just to add one more point to that, I think talking about green and energy efficiency is harmful to these conversations with developers and home buyers. And it's harmful for two reasons. One, they might not be in agreement with that issue. But even if they are in agreement with the issue, then you've still taken time talking about something that is not a primary motivator.
Can you give some other examples of things that might be primary motivators?
For which conversation? For the developer conversation, or here, actually, let me just go back up to this slide. So sorry, Kathy, was your question about developers?
Well, I was curious also if it's different from a homeowner or a developer, and what might be some examples of things that are primary motivators to homeowners. What are some examples of things that might be primary motivators to developers?
So again, it's like, how people decide is people don't have, let's see, let me put it this way. So we might have, let's talk about gun control, for instance, right? People have beliefs around those things, and changing beliefs can be extremely difficult. But how people make a certain decision, there aren't ideological beliefs around them. So people can be very flexible about how a decision is made, what information goes into making that decision. So, architects and builders are, for the home buyer, incredibly aware of what the stated preferences of home buyers are and the process that they go through. Cost, resale value, obviously location, and then yes, comfort and things like that. So these are things that people will state, or the look of a kitchen, look of an entryway. So really, it's giving them criteria and that are probably unknown to them, and connecting those criteria to their own long-term outcomes. So one of those criteria is, let's say, sound. And one of the things in the meeting map that we use is we pose a question: who do you want to control the volume inside your house? You or your neighbor with the leaf blower? And so control is we all, especially in our homes, but we all seek to control our environments. And control is a major determinant of our behavior. So, and also we all try to avoid loss. Losses are twice as influential over our decisions as gains are. So asking a person, do they want to lose a thing that they now have? The answer is no. And And also, does that thing that they want to lose, do they want to lose control? The answer is absolutely not. So that is a very specific example of a question that frames the choice and allows them to make it in a way that seeks a long-term outcome that's in their own, that is a pre-existing thing, right? They want control. That is a motivator that exists already.
Sure. Well, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Just one last one, James. So in terms of this slide that you have up and removing the inhibiting pressures, when this slide first came up, I began thinking, well, what if you were talking to a home buyer who's already owned a home? Mm-hmm. Does it make sense to sort of try to suss out from them problems that they had with their prior home and
Absolutely.
Craft a persuasive conversation about how what they're about to get solves all those problems?
One of the things in that homebuyer program and the sales training for it, is a set of questions that goes out to the homebuyer prior to the meeting. And one of those questions is, can you tell me a few things that you don't like about the current house where you're living?
Gotcha. Okay.
And that
cool.
That does a couple of things. It does what you just said, but it also does a second thing. Imagine two scenarios. Imagine you're really trying to sell anything or convince a person of anything, and you articulate the benefits perfectly, right? That's case one. In case two, you articulate the benefits perfectly, as best as possible, right? But you also have asked the person a bunch of questions about themselves to elicit their own problem-solving mechanism and their own disclosing information about their needs. In the latter case, it is much more likely that they will adopt that behavior.
This is fascinating stuff. I think we sort of come to the end of the Q&A period for now, but if you want to maybe flash up the last slide, James, so people can see, again, it'll be on the website, but who you are and where you are, erase40.org.
So it's erase40.org, and here is my email address here, if anyone wants to reach out to me.
Just speaking
Thank you
personally
so much.
Yeah, it was great. I just going to say, speak personally in terms of age, I erased 40 a long time ago. But, but I'm in an august group, and I can be persuaded by good conversations and salient and vivid examples of a great future. So, again, thank you very much, James, and hopefully the people who watch this will reach out to you and find out more about this really interesting take on the work that how to rethink a little bit the work that we do on an ongoing basis with trying to develop and design and build high performance buildings.
Great, thank you.
So with that, and thank you to the audience for participating, and keep your eyes open for future webinars from the Green Bank and the Peer-to-Peer Network. Thank you.